Hello, good afternoon. This is Phil Browning Helsel from Austin Seminary. I'm recording a video today about a Chalice Press book by Zach Moon called Coming Home, Ministry That Matters, with veterans and military families, Chalice Press, 2015. And here's the structure of the book. Chapter 1, War and Those Who Fight. Chapter 2, Bridging the Gap of Understanding. Chapter 3, Human Experiences of Combat. Chapter 4, The Life of Military Families. And Chapter 5, Pastoral Responses and the Role of Community. And every time I teach pastoral care in the area here in Texas, I experience a couple of final papers at least about this topic. And so I wanted to get a closer look at some of the research that's been coming out in pastoral care on this particular topic. Moon talks in this book about how people in the military come home and they don't really experience a sense of relief when they come back from war. They kind of come into churches and they sense that everybody in the U.S. is kind of stuck in their own bubbles. And there's a big culture shock when they return home. And some of that culture shock comes from kind of different experiences that they've had on the battlefield. And also just a lack of space for the kinds of stories that they've experienced. So I noticed that this was a hopeful book and a straightforward book that focuses on the stories of military families and veteran stories. And it draws attention to something that, and really provokes, I found it provoked a kind of self-awareness about some of my attitudes about this particular topic in this group that also might get in the way of pastoral care. So this was a helpful book, and it's not too long. It's in a format that a lot of people could grapple with, read, and understand. And so in that sense, it's a very helpful book in pastoral care. Clearly, that comes from someone who understands the topic that he's talking about. So Moon, I love these direct prophetic phrases. He says that military needs space in the pews of our churches and room in our hearts, he says in the preface on page 8 of the preface. In order to greet military veterans, we need to say more than thank you for your service, but instead reach out with the statement, we're glad you're here. And the problem is that a lot of the stories that we hear are stories of woundedness or victimhood that won't necessarily help you connect with the military person in your congregation as you seek to provide pastoral care for them. So there's limits in the narratives that we're receiving in terms of how there's a disjunction between what military families themselves and service people feel about themselves versus the main portrayals in the media. So Moon wants to expand our stories so that we could provide better care. Okay, that was the preface. And then chapter 1, War and Those Who Fight. He encourages you to do a personal inventory about your experiences of war. What spiritual perspectives help you when you face suffering? And just learning to listen to your thoughts and experiences will be a big benefit to you as you go to do pastoral care with a veteran who comes back. It'll help you listen to their experiences better. He goes through the range of different responses to war, Christian pacifism, which is a love your enemies response. And he talks about he did some interesting look at his own background from a pacifist tradition, and then moving into ministry as a military chaplain. So the early church was forbidden from participation in war. So that's Christian pacifism. Then there's also holy war, where Christianity is used as a tool to mobilize fighters who kind of, and in this sense, in the holy war framework, soldiers belong to God, and they have the imprimatur of God. Just war must be a response to a clear response to an injury where the overall damage in response must not exceed the original injury that was suffered. Christianity, he says, lacks a unified position on war, but if we have at least a framework of some of the historical understandings of war, we'll have more of an understanding of our tradition. And he thinks we can think in greater depth with our tradition around war than we're currently doing. And that kind of thinking will also help us in our pastoral care. Okay, chapter 2, Bridging the Gap to Understanding. So there's a range of reasons why people leave for war, and another part of the stereotypes that come up here, I guess, is for people who simplify those reasons. There's patriotism, leaving home, having no money for school, protecting honor, discovering meaning. So one's willingness, and here we're getting to some of the stereotypes as well, one's willingness to put on the uniform is not synonymous with the desire to kill. He encourages us to think about a willingness to serve and a sense of accomplishment that comes with it, and be willing to hear how motivations might change. So somebody might have started out in service in the armed services with a particular motivation, and those motivations might have changed over time. Also, be careful about language of branch. Don't say Army when you mean Navy or Air Force. Use the language that's particular to someone's particular branch of the military as another sign of respect. So there is that kind of formation that happens, a deep moral formation that happens in basic training. And he talks about what happens as people experience a lot of stress and then they go through that so they know how to handle it. One part of basic training is learning to kill. Another part is building unit cohesion, which is he focuses on a lot as one of the major results. And then one of the consequences of that training that happens in basic training is that you don't necessarily trust people who haven't shared that experience with you. So you'll get questions sometimes in pastoral care if you've been through that journey yourself, or if you're a veteran, have you served? And you might notice what people are asking you. They're asking you if you've had some of those same kind of world-altering experiences that come from the basic training experience. So Moon says that veterans coming back should be seen as a resource for our communities because of their service, their focus, and their discipline. Because of the ways that they've served, they have something that the church needs. If the church can kind of think with an imagination that sees the gifts of people returning from war, not simply their liabilities or their struggles. That was on page 16. Chapter 2, Bridging... this is chapter 3 now. The human experiences of combat. The human experiences of combat. So bonds that occur because of having faced danger are really profound. And so connection to one's unit and loyalty then are some of the biggest reasons why people fight. And he might say they're not necessarily the reasons why people started to fight, but they're the reasons why people stay and fight. And it feels like a betrayal, in a sense, if one cannot protect the people on your unit. And so if someone loses someone on their unit, there's also that it's the bond of connection and brotherhood and sisterhood that comes from serving together that adds into the loss, maybe for some people, a sense of betrayal or a feeling of betrayal, having betrayed someone that they should have been able to protect. And so these human experiences of combat create an intense psychological stress that is prolonged, and it's a threat to life. It's the experience of ongoing loss, and it's inner conflict. So people who come back say things like, and by the way, some of the quotes taken from conversations that Dr. Moon had with people in his work. The quotes in this book are really powerful, and they're worth the price of the book, in my estimation, because they capture just the sense of disconnection and difference that service people often come back with. So service people come back and say that everyone around them seems like children, Dr. Moon says on page 24. Chapter 4, The Life of Military Families. This is probably one of the more important chapters for pastors out there, especially if you're in an area where there's a lot of service members and their families. So he shares the story of Sparta and Leonidas and how the courage of wives and mothers became the basis for choosing that particular battalion of soldiers. So there's a sense in which if military service people suffer, in a sense, families suffer as well, but almost more invisibly in a way. One service person says, every time I'm gone for more than a week, the kids' grades go down. That's on page 28. So a question I had, is the stress different for women who deploy? It may be because of some of their different roles with family members. And part of what we're dealing with in this time is frequent redeployments. Military people often have frequent relocations. If they're the spouse of a service member, they might find that their spouse's job in the military takes precedent over their own. Then they also have the needs of a marriage and a regimented life that doesn't foster growth of relationships. So that kind of seems detached from mainstream American life. Little wonder that military families then sometimes have a little bit of a sense of, I don't want to say insularity, but a closeness that comes from kind of belonging to that particular culture. So in the cycles of deployment that we're seeing where people are going back over and over to the same arenas of war, there's an experience of children who go through anticipatory grief and anxiety. And spouses during this time face loneliness, depression, anxiety, emotional avoidance, and other forms of distancing as well. And then when you come back home, there's this mixed bag of both feeling like you wished you were back with that familiar tribe, as it were, but also kind of having a sense of having missed important milestones when you get home that nobody can really replace for you. You can't necessarily go back and do those birthday parties or anniversaries over. So what can pastors and clergy people, pastoral caregivers do for families facing this? You can try to hear the fears. You can provide care teams for families under deployment, and these care teams hopefully would include some people who are in the military or familiar with that culture. One military wife who'd faced multiple deployments said, quote, "At times it felt like those of us who were left behind were simply clinging to each other with this strange intensity and intimacy, trying to help each other breathe," end quote, on page 32. So there's a sense in which it almost doesn't matter, Moon says, what you do for families under deployment. Just do something. Anything is better than nothing to kind of rescue families from this invisibility. Chapter 5, Pastoral Responses and the Role of Community. So a church community can be a place that provides necessary support. I guess that's strengthened in a sense if those friendships are there beforehand, to provide a kind of continuity. Church can be a place where people don't necessarily push for details, but they provide care. And he also does some interesting discussion about suffering, whether we see it as an injustice or punishment or redemptive. And then if you're dealing with families who have someone deploying in their family, you don't want to badmouth a family who can't show up to work because a parent can't get the kids to church by themselves. So if a family stops showing up, there's something more that ministers can do to reach out rather than badmouthing families who can't show up any longer because they have one parent who's doing all the parenting. So a couple basic takeaways from this chapter. While we know the facts about suicide risk and mental illness after war, simply depicting veterans as mentally ill or suicidal or even wounded won't help you connect with them because it doesn't share that worldview or that language framework that they have. And he gives an example of a veteran who started to see his pastor as a new commanding officer. Moon talks about a kind of really down-to-earth approach where you meet a veteran where they are without idealizing, without pushing for details, but find the tools that you need to rebuild your relationship with that person. Because it's going to be different over time than it is now. And now chapter 6, I forgot to put that on my list for some reason, a vision for action, chapter 6. So often when you enter pastoral care with a veteran, you'll get a question, have you served? And that question is a test of integrity. Will you get frazzled by the question is one of the things that people are wondering. He gives the example of the Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City who helped veterans to have an identity and a way to identify themselves. And because it reached out in that way, it attracted nearly 1,000 veterans to that church. He argues that there needs to be different programs for Vietnam veterans and the current generation of veterans returning from war, and also different programs for men and women. And he also thinks is beginning to think about some ritual and liturgical responses to people returning from war, such as the Navajo example of the enemy way and the blessing way, in order to bring veterans home. So Moon has given us a really helpful introductory text here to ministry with veterans. And it helped me to see that this huge cultural gap that happens when people return from war, and then the ways in which some of our snap judgments or our really quick responses like thank you for your service are less helpful than we might. They might be even ways of shutting down the conversation or getting away from a conversation. So veterans definitely want to be seen as more than a victimized experience from serving. Moon wants us to think creatively about ways of engaging the stories and the gifts of veterans, and he wants us to think about the ways that could shape the body of Christ. I was really drawn to this discussion of true welcome and how we need to make space in our churches for veterans. I think there's a fear and hesitation in many people's minds to want to go there in the conversations with veterans in terms of going there with veteran stories. But I think there's also, what I sense in this book was a very warm human kindness that invites you into relationships with veterans who might be returning from war and who, even though they're wounded, in some ways, there's also not just one story about those wounds. So they've also shown resilience, and there's also gifts that they bring back to community. What's a way to incorporate them and engage their gifts so that the fullness of the body of Christ can be lived out, rather than asking veterans essentially to kind of split off some parts of their previous experience because they think it might be too hard for us. So this is an excellent book, Zach Moon's Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families. be easily readable in a couple of Sunday school sessions at a church education event by lay people or by seminary students alike. And hope you get a chance to read it. Thank you.